Here's one of the most, I think, profound and major points of this course is that the underlying structure of anything will determine its behavior. Now, most people don't think structurally, they think situationally. And so, for example, a lot of companies organize themselves around problems. It's about problem solving. And they'll proudly say, oh, we're dedicated problem solvers. And the thing about it is, you can get rid of all of your problems and still not have what you want. Problem solving is not creating. Creating is not problem solving. So over the years, we see all of these different kinds of change efforts come to the organization and to people's lives. So some of it very good. For example, I really like Deming and the whole quality movement a la Deming. I like very much. In fact, we still do that with manufacturing lines. But then quality became very popular, and about 20 years ago, we had senior vice presidents of quality or senior managers of quality position that almost doesn't exist anymore. You see it come into the organization and then over time be rejected by the organization the same way the body rejects an implanted organ. Because if the underlying structure is not conducive to change, no matter what kind of change effort you put in, no matter how good it might be, and not all of them are very good, but some of them are, it doesn't really matter the quality of the actual change effort. What will happen is the organization itself will reject it. A change of underlying structure will lead to a change of behavior. Almost invariably, people try to change things without understanding what are the underlying structural dynamics that cause the behavior to happen. And particularly in the West, our tendency is to say, when we look at something, how do we change it? Before we ask the question, how do we understand what's giving rise to the predictable patterns of behavior that we're seeing? Now, as I said in the video, structure produces two patterns of behavior, two types of behaviors, and they work very differently. One behavior is oscillation. And in oscillation, the pattern will be you set out for something, maybe you have it for a period of time, and there's a reversal that will happen, and at the end of the entire pattern, you no longer have what you set out for and what you may have had at one point. So if you look at the history of the last 20 or 30 years in the life of industry, we have people who build up capacity and then downsize, and build up capacity and downsize, or centralize decisions and decentralize and centralize and decentralize, or go in acquisition sprees and buy other companies and then divest and acquire and then divest. Focus on the market and then focus on the product and then focus on the market and then focus on the product. And you can really, if you back up, it's really hard to miss the oscillating patterns. But most people are not backed up far enough and they have no perspective. And so when you're in a structure, it's really hard to see the structure you're in. You have to get out of it to be able to see it. Now, all oscillation isn't bad. It's very good in a rocking chair. I mean, we wouldn't want to take a car on the porch, put it in first and then reverse, and put it in first and then reverse, and try to go back and forth. A rocking chair is the perfect structure if you happen to want to oscillate, which sometimes we do. But it's a terrible structure for personal life or for a company. Now, how many of you are consultants here, work as consultants? Here's a experience I'm sure you have had, which is you've come into a company, you've done your best work, you're really proud of it. Everybody is cheering you on and congratulating each other for the great success. And then you come back 2 years later and it's as if it never happened. And this is sort of like the common experience of a lot of really good consulting, is that somehow your best efforts didn't last, it didn't work. Why not? Because there wasn't an adequate change of underlying structure that would have created sustainability in those changes. I think it's really important to understand that it's nothing personal. You can start to feel like, God, what did I do? I mean, I did such great work, and now it's as if it never happened. Well, you know, it's really not personal. It really is structural. It's like nature. It's physics. You can't fool Mother Structure. Structure seeks equilibrium. In a way, that's the dynamic that causes things to happen. We're never talking metaphorically. We're always talking causally. What causes things to happen? When I have a state of non-equilibrium, or for you purists, degrees removed from equilibrium, there will always be a tension. Somebody in a company that uses our work gave me this rubber band. It says tension, let's see, structural, I don't know where it is. I don't know where the beginning is. Anyway, that's probably the bottom because it's got reality. Anyway, so whenever you have a tension itself will seek equilibrium. It's a dynamic, it's a force in play. It's not, by the way, as I said in the video, it's not stress, pressure, anxiety. It is a structure of a contrast between a desired state and an actual state. And that difference creates a state of non-equilibrium. And if we work properly in the creative process, then we bring the current state up to the level of the desired state, and they become one of the same. They become equal. We go from a situation of non-equilibrium to a situation of equilibrium. And that's a resolving, advancing kind of structure. What does that mean? Well, instead of being a problem-oriented company, it means you're an outcome-oriented company. Instead of thinking about stuff, oh, we got to solve all these problems, you begin to think of what are the outcomes that we want. I think one of the things that we've done a lot in the company that these folks work for is really shifted the orientation from a problem-driven kind of company, which they're an engineering company, for God's sake, you know. They love to problem solve. And there's nothing like a convert, so they're really a good example of this. To really thinking, what is the outcome we want? Where are we now in relationship to that? And once we've established that, what's the best way to move from here to there? It sounds simple, by the way, and it's not as simple as it sounds. Because you've got to be as clear about what you want, you have to be really clear about what you have, and then you have to really understand from a learning process how, when you're moving from here to there, as current reality changes, what are the, in a way, it's like an iterative process. What ways do we have to renew the process to really make sure it's practical and working? Let me start to give you the first few steps in structural thinking and kind of show you what we're talking about. So you go to school, and you learn things. In fact, the assumption I think most people have is education is a good thing, and the acquisition of knowledge is a good thing, right? It's good to know things. So what is it that we go to school, and what do we get in school? What do they teach us? Well, they give us information. They give us models. We have theories. We have experiences. We have various worldviews. We have concepts, and so on. A lot of stuff. What are we supposed to do with this stuff? Okay, so we have reality, and what we're supposed to do is compare reality to our database. But that's actually not thinking, that's categorizing. You know, sometimes if you go to university, they'll say, we're going to teach you how to think. But they're not going to teach you how to think, they're just going to change some of the database. The actual thought process is really the same. Even as I'm saying this, some of you are thinking, oh, that's like, and then you're trying to compare it. Your mind automatically makes associations to try to create orientation. So one of the things in teaching you this skill that we're really up against is the way that you use comparative thinking. your acquisition of knowledge and experiences that you'll then use when you're looking at something. And here is step one in thinking structurally. Step one. Start with nothing. Start with nothing. Doesn't mean, by the way, start without the ability to speak a language or process information. What it does mean is start without a knowledge base. Start without a preconception. Start without a hypothesis. This is what actual creative scientists do, is they never use this hypothesis. In fact, I have a couple of great quotes for you, which I wish I had when I was in high school, but I didn't. And one is from Sir Isaac Newton. I mean, Sir Isaac Newton, not only created traditional physics up until Einstein. I mean, he just was the granddaddy of physics. But he also, for example, invented calculus so he could figure something out. Well, by the way, he said hypotheses have no place in science. So the story of him sitting by the tree and the apple falls. And I read one book that said everything is metaphor, right? So in this particular book, the claim was everything was a metaphor for something else. And so when the apple fell and hit his head, which is the story, he used that as a metaphor. And it's actually not, it doesn't hold up to scrutiny in terms of how usually these things happen. He's sitting under the tree, the apple falls, hits him on the head, and he says, I wonder why it did that. If you start with nothing, hypotheses have no place in science. He doesn't start with a hypothesis, he starts with a question. Why did what happened happen? Descartes said, to really understand any principle or set of principles, first rid yourself of preconceptions. By the way, there's a whole discipline in companies that actually does this. And you know who they are? The accountants. The accountants actually have to look at the actual numbers. They can't say, well, we had this report last year, and this one seems kind of similar. And what I'm going to do is I'll just write in the numbers we had last year and I add maybe 20% to it, because I'm sure that'll work out really well. I mean, if you do that in accounting, you end up in jail. So accountants actually, while they know principles of accounting, they know math and they know, other accounting practices and principles, they actually have to look at the numbers originally, uniquely, not compared to anything else, but as they exist. And that's, in a way, exactly what we're doing. You're going to find yourself up against your comparative mind. We're going to give you exercises to do. And as you do them, your mind's going to say, oh, it's like that, or it's like this book, or it's that theory, or it's, and it's going to want to find some comparison. And your job is to really stay focused on exactly what it is that you have and not try to anticipate what's coming. So step one is start with nothing, no preconception. Now, step two in structural thinking in our process is to picture what is said. Now, the reason we want to teach you a visual language is because in a visual language you can think dimensionally, you can think structurally, you can think in relationships. Whereas in a linear language you can't. You can't hold as many ideas simultaneously. There's a lady in the United States called Nancy Bell, and she has a company that teaches children with learning disabilities, like dyslexia, for example, how to picture. And so what she does is she starts with them with individual words and they picture the words. And then she goes to sentences, and then they go to paragraphs, and then they go to longer phrases. Here's the point that she's making, though. That when the students begin to translate words into pictures, their comprehension goes up dramatically. And she told me that they're doing MRI brain scans right now as they're practicing and showing this and demonstrating this. And that in children that have learning disabilities, the visual centers in their brains are not working as well. They're not firing. They're not getting whatever it is that they get, energy, I suppose. But when they, and compared to, for example, a normal child, but when they work this way, in fact, they're able to open up those visual centers. And so what we're doing in this work is we're actually, no matter what your starting point in terms of visual literacy, we're helping you become better at visual literacy, opening up your visual centers in your brain. And when, the degree to which you can do that is the degree to which you can more easily observe something and understand what the relationships are over time. This is the idea. This is not based on a model. We're not going to give you a model, a diagnostic model. We're going to teach you how to look at something and understand what's there. You know, this is kind of like, in a way, art class and drawing. So he brought his students down and he pointed across the Hudson River. And he said, tell me what colors you see across there. Well, they all agreed that the brick building was red and the tower was white and this other building was orange. And then he handed out a spot screen, which is basically a card with a hole in it. And he had the students hold up the card against the background. And he said, okay, now tell me what colors you see. Well, they all got very quiet until eventually one of them said, blue. Everything over there is blue. Now, first of all, the reason that everything over there was blue is because on hazy days, you don't see the color of the objects. You see the atmosphere between you and the objects. And so often that's reflected. In this case, it was water and sky, and reflected the water and the sky, reflected in the air, and everything looked blue. This is why distant mountains often look purple or blue. The Impressionists were not painting color of objects. They were painting the air between the viewer and the objects. And that was one of the great innovations of the Impressionistic period in art, is painting the air, not the object. Well, you know, first of all, why, Stern asks in his book, why were the students thinking they were seeing red and white and orange? And he said, because art students substitute a concept of color for observation. In other words, they think a brick building should be red, so to them it looked red, even though when they isolated the color, this is what this does. It isolates the color from the object. So you're no longer looking at the object, but purely the color. Well, then they could actually see what it was. And he went on to say that art students really need to learn how to see, because they don't see. Well, this is true for all of us. You know, when you have a comparative thought process in reality, you're going to miss a lot of reality. You're going to miss things that that are not consistent with what's in your database. Your mind wants to organize things. You don't like not knowing. That's why we speculate. That's why we have a gazillion theories about things of which we know nothing. Is because we don't like to not know. So we're going to make up an answer. A lot of times those concepts are so strong that we think they're reality, even though we haven't bothered to look. Part of our job in teaching you how to think structurally is to really look better at reality without the preconception of what you're going to find. And when you do that, in fact, you find different things. Now, the fact that the visual language, translating words into pictures as a technique, the fact of that helps you eliminate biases that you might have. So it actually makes it easier for you to do step one, start with nothing, because then you're picturing just what the person said and nothing else. To really be able to picture, first of all, let's say we have a word chair. Well, there's a lot of different kinds of chairs, but this is called a class type. A class type. While there's a lot of kinds of chairs, they all have to have something in common to be a chair. You know, a chair is not a couch, it's not a table. And so if your client says, I have a chair, you may have to imagine a different kind of chair than they might actually have. That's called a placeholder. I'm going to tell you a story, and I want you to picture the story. Ready? Okay. There's a little boy, and he goes out of his house, and near his house is a hill. And he climbs the hill, and when he gets to the top of the hill, he hears his mother calling him. He comes down the hill and goes home. Now, I know this is not Gone with the Wind. Okay, could you picture that though? No, see, this is like having a little film crew in your head, and you're making a little movie of the boy coming out and going up the hill and coming back down and so on. And the way I describe this is really specific. You have a little film crew in your head, and you're making a little movie of what your client is saying. You won't necessarily always understand what they're saying, so don't fake it. Because that's where you're motivated to ask questions like, how old is he? What color hair does he have? Or other things that you need to know as by way of example. And that's the process. So this is just, again, a practice. And now I'm going to give you a next step in this form. So we start with nothing, no preconceptions. You know, we don't start with amnesia, though, or the inability to speak language. We can take all of that in. Then we picture what's said. Client talks, we're picturing it. And then we, step 3 now, I'm going to add a new step where you can ask questions. Okay, and there's only 4 types of questions that we have in structural thinking. And the questions are functional. One of the functions is information. So the information question is to expand the picture. I have a job. Information question. What kind of job? So that expands the picture. I'm only going to give you 2 questions right now, and later I'm going to give you 2 more. So these are the only 2 you can ask in this next round. So one's an information question. Second is clarification. Now, clarification can mean all kinds of things, but we mean something very specific. A clarification question in this technique is there's a word or phrase you don't know, and the question is, what does it mean? So you're asking for a definition. So, for example, a clarification would be, what is a hemiola, if you didn't happen to know? Sometimes you'll be somewhere and people will be talking about quality, you know, and, you know, we generally know what the word means, generally, quality. We generally know what it means, but we may not know specifically what they mean, and we might ask a clarification question. What do you mean by quality? So, that's the clarification question. The point is that all of the description doesn't change the picture. So sometimes your client will give you obsessive detail, and the moment you know it's a refrigerator, you say, well, is it a refrigerator? And they'll say yes, and it'll save you all of that work, or their work on their part. So, sometimes it's okay to, when you get the picture, to say what the picture is to the person so they can either confirm or change your perception. I'm going to give you two more types of questions. One question is an implication question. An implication is something is implied. Like, for example, if I said, we got to market too late, what is implied is that if we had gotten to the market sooner, the performance would have been different. Now, when you're dealing with an implication question, there are two parts to what you as consultant do. One is to identify the implication, to understand what is being implied. And then to ask a question to see if the client agrees with the implication, because sometimes people don't agree with themselves. So if I said we got to market too late, then the question would be, if you got to the market sooner, would the performance have been better? And we expect a yes to that question, because the implication is that it would have been better. So we may get a no, but at least we are identifying what's implied. A lot of times people don't say directly what they mean, but they imply things that you then can check out and take what's implied and make it explicit, make it really clear whether or not the person agrees with it. And then the other type of question is a discrepancy question. Now, a discrepancy question comes from sometimes people contradict themselves. Sometimes the discrepancy is close in time and space, and sometimes it's very far away in the session. They may say one thing over here, but you're picturing the whole thing and they say something over here, maybe 10 minutes or 20 minutes later that totally contradicts what they said here. And if you're picturing, you'll be able to immediately identify, wait, that's different, because you have the picture. But if I said, for example, this past year was a great year, sales were down. Now, there's only one of two possibilities. One is that one of those two statements is not true. So last year you had a great year, but sales were down. How did that make it a great year? Oh, did I say last year sales were down? No, they were up. Or did I say last year was a great year? No, it was the year before. Last year was terrible. Sales were down. Or there might be information we don't have that explains the apparent discrepancy. Like, for example, last year we had a great year, sales were down. How come it was a great year? Because we got the patent on a proprietary technology, and it doesn't matter about our sales because whoever sells it, we get paid. What a great year. So there you have an explanation of that explains the apparent discrepancy. But in this, again, what we need to do is to articulate, to understand something's being contradicted, and then to ask questions about it. But a lot of times when you're doing a structural consultation, particularly from a consulting point of view, and you start to sort out discrepancies, a lot of times that's where you start to see a change of underlying structure, is in sorting out how come we're looking at this discrepancy, what's to explain that? And we can end up explaining it. Might be that some things we think are true are not true. Sometimes what happens is the person doesn't have any more questions, and so what you should do at that point is just go over what you do have. Because out of that, perhaps, a question will come that's motivated by what's there. What you don't want to do is go on a fishing expedition. What you don't want to do is import questions from somewhere else. You want to keep it very much internally focused on the information that the client has provided you with, and that's part of the rigor of this. And think of it as a real discipline. You're really developing muscles. You're developing mental muscles.